I have a dream.
As a result of being born and raised as a white person in this culture, I have deep racist biases.
The contrast from racist is not racist, it is anti-racist.
Protesting started peacefully, grew violent.
They will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
From the early 2000s and through most of the Obama years, race relations in America were quite stable. After 2013, perceptions of race relations began to nosedive. Why? There may not be a single explanation, but important was the introduction of the smartphone and the massive increase of online videos and accusations of racism from then on. Since then, a perception has emerged that race relations in America have never been worse. And this perception has probably become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It culminated in the Black Lives Matter riots and protests of 2020. But, asks Coleman Hughes, is America as racist as its critics suggest? And are the solutions offered by so-called anti-racists like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi likely to make things better or worse? In The End of Race Politics, Coleman Hughes analyzes the claims of the anti-racists that racism in America is just as bad as ever, and that only through race-based discrimination can it improve. Hughes shows not only that America has been getting less racist over the years, but that the best way for continued improvement in race relations is by continuing the historic tradition of colorblindness, as opposed to anti-racist discrimination, which actually turns out to be little more than neo-racism in disguise. These are Hughes' most important ideas. First, colorblindness is a better alternative than race-based discrimination. Second, racial disparities are not necessarily caused by racial discrimination and racism. Third, poverty, not racism, is the main form of disadvantage in America and the West today. Fourth, the anti-racist movement is in fact just neo-racism. The colorblind approach asks us not to see people primarily as members of racial groups, but as individuals with their own personalities, merits, and histories. This approach characterized activism in America from the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century right up to the successful civil rights movement of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
According to colorblindness, whether a person is an oppressor or a victim depends on their own individual actions and individual history. The alternative approach is the so-called anti-racist movement, undergirded by critical race theory.
I'm just going to put it right out here. As a result of being born and raised as a white person in this culture, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist biases.
Anti-racism says that we need to make race central to how we see people and central to decisions regarding employment and education in order to stamp racism out. Furthermore, anti-racism holds that any instance of racial disparity is evidence of systemic racism. If African Americans on average earn less than non-African Americans, that whole disparity, according to anti-racists, can only be explained by American racism. According to anti-racism, whether a person is an oppressor or a victim depends on what race they belong to, regardless of their individual actions or histories. So does racism still exist? Yes. Coleman Hughes wants to make it very clear that racism is still alive and living in the West. And just because one is critiquing the so-called anti-racists does not mean that one is suggesting that racism is a myth. It still operates. A cardinal tenet of anti-racism is that all disparities between the races are owing to racism. But is this true? As Hughes says, if you're going to accuse a system of being unfair, It's not enough simply to look at the outcomes. You need to look at the process that produced them. First, Hughes completely accepts the economic and educational disparities or inequalities between races. He says that they exist, but he points out that their causes are more likely owing to factors extending beyond mere racism. For example, while it's true that African Americans on average earn less than non-African Americans, including non-white groups like Indians, Asians, and Africans who immigrated to America, it's also the case that on average, African Americans are younger than white Americans, which means that African Americans will earn less, as they are on average younger and therefore earlier in their careers and therefore making less. Furthermore, geographically, African Americans tend more on average to be located in America's southern states than white Americans are. And Southerners, black or white, tend to earn less than non-Southerners. Hughes says that the surest way to tackle disadvantage in America is to identify it properly to begin with. And the best identification of disadvantage is not race, but it is poverty. Indeed, says Hughes, the word race is often used as a proxy term for poverty. So why not just tackle poverty? Hughes says, imagine that we picked 100 Americans at random. Our task is to line them up from least privileged to most privileged so that we can use public policy to prioritize the least advantaged among them. Because there's no direct measure of privilege, we'd have to choose a proxy. My claim, says Hughes, is that lining everyone up by socioeconomic status, income, wealth, or some combination measure, would get us closer to our goal than lining them up by racial identity would. That is what I mean, says Hughes, when I say that income is a better proxy for disadvantage than race. Race-based social policies actually have a tendency to help those who need no help, while overlooking those who do. For example, despite aggressive racial affirmative action programs at Ivy League universities, only 5% of students at Harvard University come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, while the great majority of the 14% of black students at Harvard are not coming from economic disadvantage at all. In other words, Ivy League race-based affirmative action programs tend overwhelmingly to give those already socially advantaged even more social advantage, purely based on their race. Race-based affirmative action also has very obviously racist implications, for it inevitably means that perfectly qualified applicants are actually turned away purely based on their race.
If a school does not want to admit me because I'm Asian American, then there's not much I can do about that because it's a part of me that I just can't get rid of.
One study of elite colleges shows that Asians and whites had to score 450 and 310 SAT points higher than black applicants, respectively. As Hughes says, imagine if every college rejection letter included the honest reasons for rejection. If you had been black rather than Asian, we would have accepted you. How long would that policy survive? Hughes concludes, we need to support class-based policies instead of race-based policies. In this respect, Hughes supports affirmative action in terms of people from less privileged backgrounds, regardless of race. Furthermore, early age skill development, regardless of race, is a much better way to generate more social equality than race-based quotas and affirmative action based on race. The end of race politics is one of the most accessible critiques of the so-called anti-racist movement so far. Not only has Hughes offered compelling arguments showing how the movement is misleading in its description of race relations in modern America, but he shows how its solutions serve to do two main things: perpetuate racial discrimination and worsen race relations in America. In short, Hughes shows how the anti-racist movement in America, from its critical theory university courses to its popular stars like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, to its mass movement in Black Lives Matter, are in fact merely neo-racism. Positively, Hughes offers many practical suggestions about how to overcome actual racism in America, as well as the most pervasive form of disadvantage, economic disadvantage. The end of race politics is also a valuable gift for anyone who's bought into the victimhood narrative, but is not so far into the identity politics cult that they can't be reasoned with so as to avoid a life of victimhood mentality and racial prejudice. I'm Stephen Chavura for John Anderson Media.